Welcome to the NBA Coast to Coast podcast, brought to you by thelines.com. Coming to you from the West Coast, Josh Lander, joined by my guy Nate Weitzer on the East Coast. And as you can see, a very special guest here, senior writer analyst for NBA.com, Mark Medina, at @MarkG_Medina on Twitter, as you guys can see on the screen, and the author of the article NBA Midseason Media Survey, wherein a bunch of media members share their opinions at the halfway point of this 2022-23 season. We'll get into all of that, but first and most importantly, Mark, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. I mean, I'm on your guys' podcast, and a full disclosure, I don't know if I can be of helpful to the viewers as far as their bets. If I knew all the answers, I'd be raking in myself in Vegas, but hopefully the information will drive more informed gamblers on making the right decisions.
And the beautiful part is we're not necessarily here to give them the picks, but we are here to give them the info to arm them with, the ability to do that. And I think having you here, in the terms of this article and how it's going to impact things, I think your sheer information will be of value to some people. I think it's already impacted some betting markets that we've seen. That's what Steven Andress and I were talking about the other day. But let's basically dive right into the article, which again can be found at NBA.com, titled NBA Midseason Media Survey. Just really kind of want to know real briefly, a little bit more about it and what the sort of genesis of it was, how it came together for you.
The genesis of it was that my colleague John Schumann has done an annual preseason GM survey where he polls, a lot of the GMs across the league, all anonymous votes about just different preseason storylines. Hey, favorite to win the NBA championship, favorite for MVP, rookie of the year. It gets a little bit more detailed as far as like, hey, which coach makes best in-game adjustments, et cetera, et cetera. And so the folks at NBA.com thought it would be a great idea to kind of have a different version of that at the midseason point of the season, checking in basically with 3 beat writers or columnists, one from each market. And so I pulled 30 different writers, 2 from LA, 2 from New York, to account for there's 2 teams in both cities. And while the panelists were listed, all their votes were anonymous. And I think that this was really interesting because here, while the GMs always provide insight, you never know to what degree there's, self-interest involved or jockeying or, resentment about other teams. And here, while, I'm not naive to think that anyone is ever fully objective, obviously I think the people in our field, there's no self-interest involved. It's just, more of what they see on the basketball court, and the fact that we polled writers from each different market, it gives a different flavor to account for, their expertise in that market, as well as protect from any blind spots of, maybe not being as familiar with certain teams and players. But I think that there's a lot of common themes that we can get into as far as, what the sentiment was around the league.
Definitely. And I think a lot of the stuff we'll talk about here, you'll see is a little bit less of who's done well so far and a little bit more of, what you can expect in the second half is definitely what we're interested in, betting on what's going to happen. So, Nate, let's kick things off by diving right into the article with something I think you thought was the most important and maybe glaring thing in terms of the contrast between what the results of the article were and what some of the betting markets are telling us right now.
Well, as somebody who writes the power rankings on our site, is something I always am interested in, is you have this top 10 teams right now thing. And the Clippers don't appear in anyone's top 5, yet they're the overwhelming favorite when people are voting as the Western Conference champion. Also, interestingly, that Milwaukee gets a ton of second place votes when they were struggling when the survey came out. Right, they had lost about 6 to 7, I think. So I'm just interested how you think media members weigh the idea of right now versus, I think they're going to pull it together and win the championship, especially through the lens of the Clippers, who, still haven't really shown anything this season.
Yeah, well, I think with the Clippers, these 2 different questions really represent 2 different snapshots. 10 best teams in the NBA right now in this current moment. And to your point, the Clippers didn't get any votes. First, second, third, fourth, fifth place. They landed up in 9th place because of just the weight that we attach to 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th place votes. So clearly they've been underachieving. They've been dealing with a lot of overlapping injuries, whether that's actual injuries or the load management strategy that they've attached with trying to prioritize health. But I think that there's, still a handful of voters that, even though, really only 3% think that they can win the NBA title, there is optimism that they can get to the NBA Finals. 34% of voters voted for the Clippers. And I think the feeling around that is it's two things. One, I think that some voters still have in the back of their mind, hey, on paper, they still have a lot of talent and depth, and there is a window that they can finally have a full roster because of the Clippers' priority that, hey, it's about health until the big moment counts in the playoffs. And so I think that there is this feeling of, hey, you can plug and play these guys, and the lack of continuity isn't going to be as much of a factor as it was during the first season with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, because there's some semblance of familiarity. But I think it also exposes how wide open the Western Conference is as a whole. Unlike the Eastern Conference, there weren't really any predominant favorite teams. That specific question about which team would represent the West in the NBA Finals, while the Clippers got 34% plurality of the vote, there's a lot of other teams in the mix right behind them. The Denver Nuggets, they got 30% of the vote. Memphis Grizzlies, 23%. Golden State, 10%. Dallas Mavericks, 3%. So I think clearly when you look at the Western Conference landscape, there's a feeling that it's up for grabs, and there's a lot of good teams, but no dominant team. So it should be interesting, at least from a unpredictability standpoint.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. You know, I will say the Clips, not exactly heavy favorites in terms of the betting odds, but it is about the ceiling, right? And when you have the roster that they have on paper, the ceiling is probably pretty high. I would still say not really sure who their third best player is right now that you feel comfortable, you know, making them that deep of a roster enough to get into the past the play-in right now. I mean, they're basically at 500. So, you know, the next three teams listed, as we talked about, Denver, Memphis, Golden State. Denver seems to be a little bit more favored. Maybe people trust them a bit more when it comes to the playoffs with the roster as it is. Do you think it seems like they're sort of the consensus as far as, you know, the next favorite to maybe come out of the West above the other two teams in Golden State and Memphis?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, 30% is a little bit of a gap over Memphis, which was third place at 23%. I think, you know, what the Nuggets have going for them, no doubt, Nikola Jokic, you know, he could join Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain, Larry Bird as the only players in NBA history to get 3 consecutive MVPs. And, you know, as this poll shows, he got 40% of the vote. Luka Doncic got 43%. So that could be a neck-and-neck race. But I think beyond Nikola Jokic's stellar season, I think that there's just a lot of optimism with how well coached the Denver Nuggets are with under Michael Malone. Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. have been coming back from their injuries. And while there have been some growing pains with their start, it's not the same level of concern that they dealt with last season, where they're out of the lineup for significant chunks of time. And I think, you know, just from top to bottom, there's a lot more relative continuity because of the playoffs appearances that they've made in recent years, as well as their role players. So while there might be some changes with their role players, a la in Aaron Gordon and some other pieces, there is more of a feeling that there's a lot more continuity, chemistry, and plug and play as opposed to some of the other teams. The Memphis Grizzlies, no doubt, they're a young, exciting team. And while there is some optimism about that young core and what they can do, my hunch is that some of the voters still kind of have this wait-and-see approach, that it's one thing to be a young and up-and-coming team that can make the second round of the playoffs and challenge the Warriors like they did last season, but can they make that next jump into being a championship contender? Some people think yes, but there's a good amount that still think, hey, maybe wait till next season.
Yeah, it seems like that with Memphis. Also, there was a poll in there about who has the strongest young core, and the fact that they were listed as, you know, like the strongest young core still feels like people see them as, you know, a little bit too young and still need a bit more experience in the playoffs before they, you know, start believing in them making a deep run. But let's move real quick to the Eastern Conference because I do want to talk about awards briefly as well. 57% of people said Boston will repeat as Eastern Conference champs. Then there's only 3 teams total listed, right? But I think it's interesting to say that this kind of, it seems like there was a lot of movement in the Eastern Conference since this article even came out, and right around the time that it was being written. You know, knowing that it came out before the KD injury, right before that, Philly then has rattled off about 8 of 10 or 9 of 11 at this point. Miami 4 of 5, looking a lot better as some guys are getting back. So do you think this might look a little different on the Eastern Conference side if this came out maybe right now instead of, you know, a couple weeks ago at this point?
Oh, it very well could have. I mean, to the viewers here, I mean, this article was published January 10th, and I was rounding up votes within the week prior And I think that what's really interesting is it was a snapshot of just a lot of fluid moving parts. And while clearly there was a sentiment that Boston's the predominant favorite, the Milwaukee Bucks are second place, there was a lot of mixed feelings about the Brooklyn Nets recent resurgence after, them going through a lot of turbulence, on and off the court. They had 40 first place votes, but they only had 81 second place votes. And then you juxtapose that with the Milwaukee Bucks. They only had 10 first place votes, but 117 second place votes. So I think with that, when you compare that with the Boston Celtics, they had 250 first place votes and 27 second place votes. Now, I need to caution, to clarify with these votes here, it's 30 members. These point totals I'm giving you are weighted, but it really just goes to show that there were some people that were really high on the Nets and think that this shows it is the real deal, while some still have a healthy dose of skepticism, while the Milwaukee Bucks were seen as kind of the safe second pick. But to your point, the predominant theme was, hey, Boston Celtics, not only will they get to the East, represent the East in the NBA Finals, 57% of the vote, but they're favored 57% of the vote to win the NBA Finals. I think the reasons for that, there's a lot of them. Jason Tatum, even though he's not heavily favored to be the winner of the MVP, he is among those candidates. They have a lot of continuity from last season's finals run where, basically they didn't really lose many players. They added a few players, and Malcolm Brogdon most notably. And then even with the coaching change, that could have been seen as a net negative to start the season, with Ime Udoka being removed and putting in Joe Mazzulla, who hasn't been a head coach in this league, but he's shown that he has the chops and that his prior experience as being a very valued assistant coach has gone a long way. So I think the Bucks, there were some similar elements of continuity and optimism that Chris Middleton is back, but it just doesn't seem like among the voters' feelings that the Bucks have as much talent and depth as the Celtics do.
And interesting, all three of these Eastern Conference teams we're talking about got all of the first place votes for best in the league right now. And if you look at the finals odds, minus 130 for the Eastern Conference to win it. I was kind of a year early on this, maybe. I was on my soapbox telling Josh the East is now better at the top, but the Celtics couldn't close it out there over the Warriors. But what do you think this survey says about the state of the two conferences, and have we finally, hit that ecosystem equilibrium, if you will, after the East was so much worse for so long?
Yeah, I think it's basically flipped. Now, to your point, I think if I did this poll today, things would have changed a little bit. Philadelphia probably would have moved up higher in the standings. But I think, whether it's today or when the poll is actually published, what it clearly shows is that there's the heavy hitters at the top of the conference are considered a lot better, a la Boston, Milwaukee, throw in Brooklyn there, compared to the other favored teams in the West with Denver and Memphis and the Clippers. But I think from top to bottom, while there's not as much separation in the Western Conference and it's seemingly up for grabs, there is still a feeling with the Eastern Conference that even the bottom tier teams are also a lot better, where there is a recipe for Cleveland and Philadelphia and Miami, which wasn't even in the top 10, to climb up in the standings. And so while you look at the top 10 votes for the top 10 teams as of now, while Denver and Memphis and New Orleans and the Clippers and Dallas got some votes, I don't think from top to bottom they were seen as strong as many of the Eastern Conference counterparts. And that's, I think been a really abrupt identity shift, and it really coincides with basically the Warriors aren't the same team as they were before. Same thing with the Lakers. During the Warriors dynasty years, it just seemed inevitable that not only would the NBA Finals run through the Warriors in the Western Conference Finals, but that they were the predominant favorites to win it all. And then when they went through their rebuilding years because of Kevin Durant leaving as a free agent and Steph Curry and Klay Thompson having their injuries, I mean, that was the time for the Lakers to take the mantle because LeBron James is teaming up with Anthony Davis. But when you look at those two, previously dominant teams no longer being where they are, the West has as a result has become much more wide open, and B, the Eastern Conference relative talent and experience has become much more valuable than what some of the younger teams in the Western Conference have shown.
Yeah, and I think there's a pretty clear sort of line you can connect between, the players that have come over from the Western Conference to the Eastern Conference,
Yeah.
starting with KD after that injury, right? And then you got Donnie Mitchell over there. James Harden came over to the Eastern Conference. DeMar DeRozan came over to the So like everybody who was helping sort of that parity in the West, and all those teams who were hoarding superstars to try to compete with the Warriors. A lot of those guys started leaving, going east. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing right now for sure. So understanding where that's at. But let's go ahead and wrap things up here, with awards, because I think, Mark, this is the place where, a lot of people are going to want to know, what does the media think? Because these are the people who are literally, voting on this award and all of these awards as we look at them. So I think we want to start with MVP. It's definitely obviously the one that gets the most attention as far as individual awards. It's shaping up as a two-man race at this point. Interesting, really, narratives as you see it. Last year, Jokic carried a bad team to the 6th seed. This year, Denver's first in the West, so they're obviously a much, much better team around him. And then you've got voter fatigue with him. And then for Luka, the other guy in this race at this point, currently carrying a bad team to the 5 seed, similar to last year with Jokic. So all these factors, and all these variables, how do you think the media seems to be weighing all of them at this point in the season, roughly, let's say 55, 56 games in?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. Before I dive into the numbers here, just some disclaimers, because I know maybe this information can affect some of our viewers' behavior here. One, this is obviously very fluid. Things can very much change. That's just how the NBA is. And while I think that this is a revealing snapshot of polling, 30 different media members, I think that what viewers have to be aware of when it comes to the actual voting awards is two things. One, there's a much wider pool of candidates that vote in these awards. It's in the hundreds. It's not just 30 voters. So that might sway, just the sample size, right? I think the second thing here is that, I didn't necessarily take a poll from each media member, but the media members that I talked to, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they actually vote in the actual awards. There are some publications that have strict policies that they don't want their writers to vote in awards because, they don't want to affect, they don't want to have a role in affecting maybe a player's contract for making an All-NBA team or any other reasons. But those disclaimers aside, I think what's revealing about this MVP award specifically is something that surprised me. I thought that there would be, almost like a top 5 feel of, everyone has a chance. And here, it seemed very clearly it's just neck and neck between Luka Doncic and Nikola Jokic, where Luka got 43% of the votes, Jokic got 40%. Giannis only got 7% of the votes. Same with Jason Tatum. Kevin Durant got 3% of the votes. So while those numbers can very much change, I think that it's also established just a few things with Luka's play. He's just been posting triple doubles, carrying the Mavericks on his team, and as much as he's shown that he is a superstar even before this season, he's just getting started here. And I think that there's also credit that if you remove Luka Doncic, would the Mavericks be basically a lottery team? Right now, they've been, a team that could maybe finish 4th in the West, or maybe be a team that just gets in the play-in tournament. But you imagine what they look like without Luka, and it would be probably competing for ping pong balls. With Jokic, I think there's a few things. Obviously, he's been very consistent with his play and building off what he's shown in his previous 2 MVP seasons. There hasn't really been much of a voter fatigue as of now. The Nuggets are actually a team that is contending in the Western Conference as opposed to just being a team that could make the playoffs. So maybe there is an award for a player being on a winning team. I know that some voters feel that is something that's very important. And so what I'm curious about moving forward is if these are the themes that's going to stand the test of time, how does it come down to these elements? To what degree will voters place importance on being on a winning team? Because if that is a thing, clearly Nikola Jokic is the favorite candidate, because I don't think that the Dallas Mavericks are going to be a contender in the Western Conference. And when you look at, their results throughout the season. Yeah, they've gone on some winning streaks, but they've also gone on some significant losing streaks as well. And while, guys like Christian Wood and Spencer Dinwiddie and Tim Hardaway Jr. have been serviceable players, it's clearly been about Luka Doncic carrying the team. Where with Jokic, surely he's had those moments, but, there's just a lot more depth. So I will be fascinated to see to what degree will the team's record matter or not. And I think depending on that variable might very well dictate who winds up hoisting that MVP trophy at the end of the season.
Yeah, and kind of the similar feel with Defensive Player of the Year. Everyone seemed pulled either Jaren Jackson Jr., Brook Lopez, or Jared Allen, which coincidentally are on the top 3 in defensive efficiency here. How much is it, that guy improving a defense and being the reason that they're number 1 in defensive efficiency, with Lopez winning that survey, because the Bucks struggled so much when he was out last year, and now they kind of see the addition. Versus, Memphis, or was it just a case of now Memphis is number 1 because Triple J just continues to do what he's done during this 10-game win streak, and maybe it would have flipped at this point where you now see him as the clear favorite in betting sites.
Yeah, well, 2 quick disclaimers here. It's a predominant theme during this podcast. Obviously, things are fluid, but the other disclaimer is that not only with this question, but with every question, writers didn't provide their explanations, nor did they ask them. It was just about a single vote. So with that, there is some ignorance I have as far as hey, why did voters specifically choose Jaren Jackson Jr. or Brook Lopez? But I think, one of the things to keep in mind about these 2 candidates, and, my colleague Steve Ashburner, who does a defensive ladder rankings every week, he had some notable stats here where, Jaren Jackson Jr., for how effective he has been as a defensive player, he hasn't always been available. I mean, per his calculations up through Monday's game against the Phoenix Suns, he's been on the floor for 704 minutes out of a possible 2,074 total minutes. And so that includes 16 games in which he didn't play at all because he was recovering from foot surgery. So that may have been a significant variable about just, hey, your availability can dictate how well you're playing. But I think it's one of those things of, when you look at his body of work when he's been available, he's been very effective. You juxtapose that with Brook Lopez. It's been one of those things about, how they've been with and without him. And, he's been the top of the leaderboard in the NBA in total blocks, tied for blocks per game as well. And so I wouldn't be surprised that some of those favored odds toward Lopez went toward the fact that, hey, he's had a established resume as far as what he's brought defensively throughout his career, most recently with Milwaukee, as well as Jaren Jackson Jr.'s injury challenges at the beginning of the season.
Yeah, and I think it all adds up to the fact that these betting markets are not necessarily only weighing what they think the media will do. I think there's a bit of, they're setting these lines so that people will bet on them and that they can win and get it even on both sides. We know how that whole gambit works. So, don't necessarily look at the odds and the contrast and what certain writers who vote on this are saying even, because they might even just be playing up the hype. I mean, Jaren Jackson Jr. gets some sizzle reel blocks consistently, even if he is only getting 25, 26 minutes. And I think we all know how that can impact, what you're seeing on SportsCenter Top 10 impacts what you think of a certain guy and what you might be willing to place on him in terms of money on that. So all really, really great stuff, man. We really appreciate this with you, Mark. Is there any other stuff that you wanted to say, even if it is a disclaimer, another one, which we do appreciate all of them, anything you'd like to say before we part ways?
No, I mean, I think we covered it really well. I think, if you want to make a safe bet for the viewers there, it seems like that Paolo Banchero is going to win Rookie of the Year. He got 97% of the vote here. Maybe he won't get a lot of earnings because of how that affects the lines, but he's the predominant favorite. Benedict Mathurin only got 3% of the vote, but I think aside from Rookie of the Year, it just seemed like it's wide open as far as all the other awards are concerned. And so it should be very interesting to say the least. But yeah, nonetheless, I appreciate you guys having me on, and it was really fun to be able to kind of talk and analyze all these different results with the servo.
Yeah, much appreciated as well. I will just mention for the viewers, minus 1,200 for Paolo if you want to bet on him to win, meaning that you would need to go ahead and put down $1,200 to win back 100 on Paolo Banchero if you're feeling really frisky on that. Does feel pretty good. You're just hoping he doesn't get injured, but Benny Matt's right behind him at plus 800. He would be the guy, but yeah, I think the way Paolo controls that Orlando, that squad as a whole, probably feel good about him winning that award this year. Either way, that is all the time. Again, thanks so much, Mark, for joining us. Want to make sure you guys all know it is called the NBA Midseason Survey on NBA.com. You can still check that out and follow along with Mark on Twitter as well. So until we see you next, happy betting.